"You paid for me, now do it." The rancher did it. And then he had a wife. John Harper had always been a man of routine. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen over the rolling hills, he was already in the barn, tending to the cattle. The smell of hay, the lowing of the cows, and the soft warmth of the horses under his hands were the only companions he had ever known. He liked it that way. Life on the ranch was honest work, predictable and quiet, qualities he valued more than friendship, small talk, or the occasional town gossip. Over the years, he had grown used to the solitude. The small town nearby whispered about him sometimes, calling him stubborn, proud, or difficult to approach, but John paid no attention. His only company was the land, the animals, and the endless horizon stretching far beyond his fences. Even in the long winters, when snow blanketed the pastures and the wind whistled across the plains, John found comfort in the rhythm of his work. He would wake before dawn, feed the animals, repair fences, check the water troughs, and ride across the fields to make sure the cattle were safe. There was satisfaction in a day well spent, even if it was spent entirely alone. Meals were simple, often eaten at his small wooden table, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the window where the snow shimmered in the early light. He had no wife, no children, no family to interrupt his carefully structured days. Life was simple, and he preferred it that way, but change often comes unexpectedly. One morning, a caravan of strangers arrived in town. Wagons rumbled down the dusty main street, horses stampeded nervously, and people gathered to watch. They were part of a traveling auction, moving from town to town, selling everything from farm equipment to livestock, and sometimes people who had been left with no other choice. John had never attended such an event. He had no interest in buying unnecessary things, and the idea of people being treated like objects made him uneasy. Yet something about that day pulled him toward the town square. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was the rare thought that his life, steady as it was, might be missing something he could not name. When he arrived at the auction, he saw a woman standing quietly among the crowd. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with tired eyes and hands that showed the roughness of a hard life. Her hair was dark, tied loosely behind her head, and her clothes were plain but clean. She looked at John with a cautious, almost fearful glance, as though she had learned early in life that strangers could not be trusted. The auctioneer spoke loudly, describing her as someone who had fallen on hard times, someone who needed care, and someone whose future was uncertain unless someone stepped forward. The words felt strange and wrong to John. People shouldn't be bought or sold, yet here she was, standing quietly, her life being discussed as if it were a possession. The townspeople murmured among themselves. "Who would do such a thing?" some whispered. Others shrugged, saying, "It's just the way of the world." She has no family, no one to care for her. John's heart tightened. He had always lived a solitary life, yet a spark of something unfamiliar flickered inside him. Responsibility, perhaps, or the realization that he could change a life for the better. Without fully understanding why, he stepped forward and bid. The auctioneer's eyes widened slightly as John's offer was accepted. The crowd murmured again, and the woman looked at him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She did not speak, but her eyes seemed to ask the question he had already considered. "What now?" The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Maria, her name was Maria, he had learned, sat in the back of the wagon, hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape pass by. John did not speak much, not because he was unfriendly, but because he did not know how to begin. Words felt clumsy when lives were at stake, when a human being's future rested, at least in part, on him. Yet as the hills grew closer and the ranch came into view, John felt a strange mixture of apprehension and resolve. This was not just another day of routine work. Something important had shifted. At the ranch, John showed Maria the basics, the small cabin where she would stay, the barn, and the land. She listened carefully, nodded when necessary, and moved with quiet grace, as if already used to adjusting to the expectations of others. John watched her closely, noticing the small details, the way she examined the tools, the careful way she tended to the horses, and the subtle confidence in her movements. She was capable, he realized, more capable than he had expected. This was a woman who had survived hardships that most would find unbearable, and yet she was standing before him, ready to begin a new chapter in life, even if that chapter was uncertain and unchosen. The first few days were awkward. Maria tried to follow the routines John expected, but she was unfamiliar with ranch work. She dropped tools, misjudged the strength needed to lift hay bales, and sometimes wandered too close to the cattle in her nervousness. John, patient but firm, corrected her gently. "Hold it like this," he said, demonstrating, "and keep your back straight." At first she hesitated, but slowly she adapted, her movements becoming steadier, more confident. They did not speak much outside of instructions, but in those quiet moments, a silent understanding began to form. Maria respected the work. John began to notice her resilience. In the evenings, the silence of the ranch returned. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. John sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky turn colors of orange and pink. Maria would sometimes join him, sitting at a distance, unsure of where to begin. They did not need many words. Companionable silence was enough. Yet even in that silence, John could feel a connection forming. Not the easy kind of friendship, not the romantic kind yet, but a sense that they were no longer strangers. They were two people learning to navigate a shared space, two lives beginning to intersect in ways neither had anticipated. One evening, as a gentle wind rustled the trees and the first stars appeared in the sky, John thought about how much his life had changed in a matter of days. He had purchased a responsibility, yes, but more than that, he had opened a door to something new. For years, he had thought solitude was enough. He had thought the ranch, the cattle, and the quiet were all he needed. Yet now, with Maria on the porch beside him, he realized that companionship, even unexpected and uncertain, might be something he had long avoided but secretly hoped for. Maria, too, was beginning to adjust. She had lived a life of uncertainty and hardship, yet she had learned quickly how to handle the routines of the ranch. She noticed small things about John, the way he cared for every animal, how he rarely spoke of himself, and how he watched the land with quiet pride. Slowly, she began to feel that this ranch, this life, might be a place where she could belong. Not immediately, not without effort, but perhaps, eventually, this could be home. By the end of the first week, a rhythm had begun to form. John and Maria worked side by side, shared meals at the table, and exchanged small, careful conversations. They had not yet spoken of feelings or of the future, and perhaps they never would at this stage. But trust, subtle and fragile, was beginning to grow. The ranch, once a place of complete solitude, was slowly becoming a space of shared life. The animals thrived under their combined care, the fences grew stronger, and the land felt more alive than it had in years. John would never admit it aloud, but he was no longer entirely alone. He had stepped into a situation he had never imagined, a responsibility he had not sought, and yet, in ways he could not name, he was grateful. Life had a way of surprising him, even now, when he thought he had seen and endured everything. And Maria, quiet and strong, was a living reminder that even in the hardest circumstances, change could come, and sometimes it could bring unexpected hope. The sun rose the next morning over the ranch, painting the hills gold. John saddled his horse, Maria following with the feed, and together they faced the day's work. It was simple, honest, and demanding, but it was also alive with possibility. Neither could know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Life had shifted, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The first days at the ranch had been quiet, cautious, and full of learning. Maria was slowly becoming part of the rhythm of John's life, and John, in turn, began noticing details about her that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just her ability to adapt that impressed him. It was the determination in her eyes, the quiet strength that carried her through long days of work without complaint. She moved with care around the cattle, handled the horses with steady hands, and even learned to repair broken fences with a patience that matched John's own. Every day he saw her grow more confident, more comfortable in this new life that was not her choice, but had now become hers in small ways. Maria, for her part, observed John carefully. She had grown up in circumstances where people's words could not always be trusted, where promises were easily broken, and where survival often depended on keeping distance. Yet, John Harper was different. He was not warm in the way most people expected. He rarely smiled without reason, rarely offered more than the instructions required. But there was honesty in his actions. When he said the cattle needed feeding, they were fed. When he said a fence was weak, it was repaired. He did not pretend to be something he was not. Maria learned quickly that with John there was no hidden meaning, no trickery, only work, responsibility, and quiet reliability. One morning, the sky was painted with soft shades of orange as the sun climbed above the hills. John was already at the barn, checking the water troughs for the horses, when Maria appeared carrying buckets of feed. Her movements were careful, almost tentative, but there was a steadiness in her steps that told John she was learning. He nodded at her silently, not needing to speak. Together they moved through the chores, filling the troughs, brushing the horses, and counting the cattle. Sometimes a cow would wander off, and they would have to guide it back, working as a team without speaking much. The silence was not empty. It was filled with understanding, a quiet connection forming in the rhythm of shared work. After the morning chores, John invited Maria to help with the repairs around the ranch. A fence had been damaged during a recent storm, and the posts needed replacing. Maria lifted the wood with surprising strength, and John could not help but notice the determination in her eyes. "Careful with your back," he said, showing her how to lift the posts safely. She nodded, following his instructions with focus, and soon they were working together smoothly. Every time a post was set, John felt a subtle satisfaction, not just in the work being done, but in the realization that Maria was becoming part of the ranch, part of his life. The afternoons were long and sometimes tedious, but Maria found small moments of joy. She loved riding the horses across the fields, feeling the wind on her face, the soft thud of hooves against the earth, and the sense of freedom that came with the open land. John often rode beside her, watching carefully as she guided the horse with confidence. He had expected her to struggle, perhaps even fear the large animals, but she moved with a calm assurance that surprised him. In those moments, when they rode side by side across the hills, there was no need for words. The land, the animals, and the shared experience spoke for them. Evenings brought a different kind of challenge. John was not used to sharing meals or conversation. Maria, though quiet at first, began preparing simple dishes in the small kitchen of the cabin. He watched her work, noticing the care she put into every task, from washing the vegetables to arranging the food on the table. At first, he did not say much, eating in silence while she sat across from him. But gradually, the quiet meals became a time for conversation. They spoke of small things, the weather, the state of the crops, the health of the cattle. Slowly, the conversations became less about instructions and more about sharing. Maria told John about her childhood, her family, and the struggles she had faced. John listened, sometimes offering advice, sometimes simply nodding. The more he listened, the more he realized that her experiences had made her resilient, intelligent, and capable of handling more than he had initially believed. One day, while checking the northern pasture, John noticed Maria struggling with a stubborn cow that had wandered close to the creek. The animal was nervous and skittish, and Maria was having trouble guiding it back to the herd. John rode over quickly, helping her calm the animal and lead it safely. Afterward, Maria looked at him with gratitude, and John felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He realized that he was beginning to care for her in ways that went beyond simple responsibility. She was no longer just the woman he had purchased. She was someone he respected, someone whose safety mattered to him deeply. The trust between them grew slowly but steadily. Maria began to take initiative, anticipating what needed to be done before John could instruct her. She learned to repair fences, feed the animals without supervision, and even manage the barn chores when John was busy. John, in turn, began to allow her space, recognizing her abilities and giving her responsibilities that he had never given anyone before. Their relationship was evolving from one of obligation to one of partnership, built on mutual respect and shared effort. One evening, a heavy rainstorm swept across the ranch. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded against the roof of the cabin. The cattle were restless, the fences creaked under the force of the storm, and the creek threatened to overflow. John and Maria worked together to secure the animals and strengthen the vulnerable fences. The hours were long, exhausting, and filled with the constant challenge of staying ahead of the storm. Through it all, Maria remained composed, following John's instructions and offering suggestions when she noticed potential problems. By the time the storm passed, both were soaked, tired, and exhilarated by the experience. It was a test of their ability to work together, and they had passed it. After the storm, as they sat by the fire in the cabin, drying off and sharing a simple meal, John felt a deep sense of connection. Maria spoke quietly about her fears and her past, and for the first time, John shared something of his own life. He spoke of his childhood on the ranch, the loss of his parents, and the years he had spent alone. Maria listened attentively, offering no judgment, only understanding. The fire crackled between them, and in that warmth a fragile bond began to form, a bond built on trust, shared hardship, and mutual respect. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of life at the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. John and Maria worked side by side, shared meals, and spent evenings talking by the fire or watching the sunset over the hills. The silent moments, once awkward, now carried a sense of ease. They no longer needed constant words to communicate. A glance, a gesture, or a shared task was enough. Maria learned to anticipate John's needs, and John began to rely on her presence. The ranch, once a place of complete solitude, was now alive with cooperation, conversation, and a subtle sense of companionship. Through it all, John noticed small changes in himself. He was no longer entirely alone in his thoughts. He found himself smiling more often, feeling a quiet anticipation when he knew Maria would join him for the morning chores, and even enjoying the shared meals in ways he had never expected. He began to appreciate not only her skills and resilience, but also her kindness, her quiet humor, and the way she approached life with determination and grace. He had never thought much about love or partnership, but slowly he realized that his feelings for Maria were changing. She was no longer a stranger or a responsibility. She was becoming someone essential to his life. Maria, too, was experiencing change. She had entered the ranch under uncertain circumstances, unsure of what her future would hold. Yet she found stability in the routines, comfort in the quiet of the land, and a growing sense of belonging in the shared work and companionship with John. She began to see the ranch not as a place where she was confined, but as a place where she could thrive, where her efforts were valued, and where she could be herself without fear. The trust between them had become the foundation for something deeper, something neither had expected when the auction had brought them together. By the end of the second month, life on the ranch felt different, fuller, richer, and more alive. The land thrived under their joint care, the animals were healthier, and the bond between John and Maria was undeniable. They had moved beyond the initial awkwardness and obligation into a space of partnership, trust, and mutual respect. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude and routine, had become a place of connection, growth, and the beginnings of something extraordinary. The ranch had settled into a new rhythm, but life there was far from easy. John Harper had always known the land could be unforgiving, storms, broken fences, wandering cattle. But now he had someone at his side who was learning to face these challenges with him. Maria was no longer tentative. She had grown into her role, moving with confidence through the daily chores, riding the horses with steady hands, and even making decisions about how to handle the cattle. John watched her carefully, noticing the small changes in her expression, the way her eyes held determination, and the way her shoulders no longer carried the tension of uncertainty. She was learning to trust him, and he was learning to trust her in ways that surprised him. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm approached from the west. The sky darkened quickly, the wind picked up, and the first drops of rain began to fall. John noticed the change immediately. Cattle would get nervous in storms, and fences could be weakened by strong winds. He turned to Maria, who was tending to a group of calves near the barn. "We need to bring them in now," he called, his voice firm but calm. Maria nodded, understanding instantly what needed to be done. Together, they moved quickly, guiding the nervous calves toward the barn while keeping the larger cows from panicking. The storm was coming faster than they had anticipated, and the wind blew with a strength that made it difficult to hear or move. The first few minutes were chaotic. Cows stampeded slightly, hooves kicked up mud, and the rain soaked through their clothes almost immediately. Maria's hands were steady as she helped John guide the animals. Her movements were precise, her focus unbroken despite the chaos. John felt a deep respect for her in that moment, not just for her strength, but for her courage under pressure. She didn't falter, didn't panic, and she never questioned what needed to be done. Together, they corralled the animals into the barn, closing the gates just as the storm hit in full force. The rain poured, thunder rumbled, and the wind rattled the wooden beams. But inside the barn, the animals were safe, and John and Maria could finally breathe. After securing the animals, they worked to strengthen the weaker fences and tie down the barn doors. The wind howled around them, rain slapping against their faces, but they continued moving together, communicating with hand signals and short shouts when needed. Every time Maria handed John a rope or a post, their hands brushed, and for a moment both felt a quiet spark of connection amidst the chaos. The storm had forced them to rely on each other in ways that went beyond work. They were partners in survival, in responsibility, and slowly in trust. By the time the storm passed, both were soaked and exhausted. Their clothes clung to them, hair plastered to their faces, and their muscles ached from the labor, but there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. They had faced the storm together and had succeeded. Maria wiped her face with the back of her hand and gave a small smile. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. John nodded, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. He realized that in the midst of the storm, he had also realized how much he relied on her, not just for the work, but for her presence, her steadiness, and her courage. That evening, they sat by the fire in the cabin, drying off and sharing a simple meal. The storm had left the world outside calm and fresh, the scent of wet earth and grass filling the air. Maria spoke quietly about her fears and the difficult moments she had faced before arriving at the ranch. John listened, sharing some of his own experiences, his childhood on the ranch, the years spent in solitude, and the small victories of managing the land. Their conversation was honest and unguarded, and for the first time, both felt a sense of closeness that went beyond work or necessity. They were learning to understand each other on a deeper level, and it felt as if the storm had cleared more than just the sky. In the days that followed, life continued with its mix of challenges and routine. The storm had left some damage, and repairs were needed across the ranch. Fences had to be rebuilt, fences reinforced, and the barn doors checked for strength. Maria took the lead in some of these tasks, showing John that she could handle responsibility and make decisions on her own. John observed silently, impressed by her growing confidence and the way she moved with assurance. It was clear she was no longer just learning from him. She was becoming his partner in every sense, capable of sharing the burden of the ranch and the life it required. One morning, as they worked in the fields, Maria noticed a problem with one of the water troughs. The pipe was leaking, and the water was running into the soil instead of reaching the animals. She called John over, showing him the damage. John examined it, then stepped back and allowed her to try fixing it first. Maria worked carefully, adjusting the pipe, tightening connections, and checking the flow. John watched silently, realizing that trust was no longer one-sided. He could rely on her to handle situations independently, and he felt a quiet pride in her ability. When the water finally flowed correctly, she smiled at him, and he returned the smile, feeling a warmth that went beyond satisfaction with the work. Evenings were spent differently now. Sometimes, after a long day of labor, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the hills. Maria would hum quietly, a tune she remembered from her childhood, and John would listen, feeling the tension of the day melt away. They began to share stories, some funny, some serious, some memories of their past lives. The more they talked, the more they realized how much they had in common despite the differences in their backgrounds. Trust and understanding grew with every shared story, every laugh, and every quiet moment spent together. One afternoon, a stray calf wandered into a part of the field near the creek, separated from the rest of the herd. Maria noticed immediately and called for John. Together they moved to guide the calf back, working with patience and care. The calf was nervous, but Maria's calm voice and gentle hands reassured it. John watched, impressed by her empathy and intuition. It was not just physical strength or knowledge of the land that made her valuable. It was her ability to connect, to understand, and to act with kindness even under stress. By the time the calf was safely returned to the herd, John felt a deep admiration for her, one that went beyond the surface of daily work. Their bond continued to deepen in small ways. John began to notice the little things, how Maria would make sure the animals had extra water during hot days, how she remembered details about the farm without being told, and how she always looked for ways to help without seeking recognition. Maria noticed small details about John as well. His stubbornness, yes, but also his loyalty, his quiet sense of humor, and the way he cared deeply for the land and animals he loved. These small observations built a foundation of respect, understanding, and quietly affection. One evening, as the stars appeared in the sky and the ranch lay bathed in moonlight, John and Maria sat quietly by the fire outside. The world was calm, the air cool, and the gentle sounds of the animals at rest surrounded them. They did not need to speak to feel the closeness that had developed between them. The trust built through days of work, shared responsibilities, and facing challenges together had transformed into a connection neither had expected. It was quiet, subtle, but undeniably there, a bond that would grow stronger in the days to come. Life on the ranch continued, not without its challenges, but with a sense of partnership that brought comfort and confidence. The animals thrived under their care, the fences and barns grew stronger with each repair, and the land seemed more alive than ever. John and Maria had learned to rely on each other, to communicate without words, and to trust in one another's abilities. The connection they shared was no longer just about survival or obligation. It was about mutual respect, understanding, and the quiet beginnings of a deeper bond that neither had fully acknowledged, but both felt growing with each passing day. By the end of the third month, the ranch felt alive in a new way. The storm had passed, the repairs were complete, and the daily work had become a shared rhythm of effort and care. John looked at Maria one evening as she checked on the animals, her movements confident and assured, and realized how much she had become part of the ranch, part of his life, and part of him. He had entered this situation with caution and responsibility in mind, but now he felt something more, something warmer, something quietly powerful. And Maria, as she worked beside him, felt the same shift, a sense of belonging, trust, and partnership that went beyond anything she had expected when she arrived at the ranch so uncertain and wary. As the weeks passed on the ranch, something between John and Maria began to shift, in ways neither of them fully understood at first. Their days were still filled with chores, feeding the animals, repairing fences, checking the water troughs, and riding the land. But the quiet moments in between had begun to carry a new significance. It was in the way Maria would pause to notice a bird perched on a fence post, or the way John would watch her carefully as she adjusted the feed for the calves, ensuring each one received enough. Their interactions were no longer solely about work. There was a softness, a shared understanding, and an unspoken bond that was growing slowly but unmistakably. One morning, as the sun painted the hills in soft gold, John noticed Maria humming quietly as she worked. She didn't realize he was watching, but her voice carried across the yard, light and gentle, threading its way into the morning air. John felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a quiet joy he had not felt in years. He had always valued the calm and predictability of his solitary life. Yet now, with Maria there, he found that the simple moments, the sound of her voice, the careful way she handled the animals, the small smiles exchanged when tasks were completed, brought a comfort he hadn't known he was missing. Maria, too, was feeling the subtle changes. She had arrived at the ranch under circumstances she could not control, unsure of her future and wary of trust. But the more time she spent with John, the more she recognized his steady presence, his honesty, and his deep care for the land and the animals. Slowly, she began to see him not just as the man who had bought her fate, but as someone dependable, kind, and capable of warmth beneath the stoic exterior. She began to appreciate his humor, though it was quiet and understated, and the way he never pretended to be more than he was. These small observations, over time, made her feel safe and valued in a way she had rarely experienced. One afternoon, they were repairing a section of fence near the northern pasture when a stray calf wandered too close to the creek. Maria called for John, and together they guided the animal back to the herd. As they worked side by side, hands brushing occasionally, they exchanged a few words, laughter, and gentle reminders. There was a sense of ease now, a comfort in the shared labor and quiet conversation. John noticed the way Maria's eyes sparkled with focus, the determination in her movements, and the small smile that appeared when she succeeded. He realized he was no longer merely responsible for her safety or well-being. He was genuinely invested in her happiness, her growth, and her presence on the ranch. In the evenings, the cabin felt warmer than before, not because of the fire, but because of the companionship that had quietly settled into their lives. They began sharing more personal stories, memories of childhood, hopes for the future, and even small fears that had stayed hidden for years. Maria spoke of her family, the struggles she had faced, and the resilience she had developed to survive. John shared his memories of growing up on the ranch, the loneliness he had endured, and the quiet satisfaction of tending the land he loved. These conversations were not forced. They unfolded naturally, filled with pauses, laughter, and moments of reflection. Through these exchanges, a deeper understanding grew between them, a foundation of respect, empathy, and shared experience. One evening, as a cool breeze rustled through the trees, John and Maria sat outside, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple, and the air smelled of fresh earth and grass. Maria spoke softly about her dreams, small ambitions she had once thought impossible, and the new life she hoped to build. John listened attentively, offering encouragement and support, and realizing for the first time that he wanted to be part of her dreams, not just the work of the ranch. It was a quiet revelation, but a powerful one, an acknowledgement that their connection had moved beyond trust and companionship into something deeper, something more meaningful. The days continued with their routines, but now every task carried a subtle joy. Maria's laughter echoed across the fields as she guided the horses or tended to the animals. John found himself seeking her presence during the chores, enjoying the sound of her voice, and noticing the small ways she made life on the ranch smoother, lighter, and more enjoyable. They began to anticipate each other's needs without speaking, a silent teamwork born from days of shared labor and mutual respect. Even when the work was exhausting or the weather harsh, they found comfort in the shared effort, knowing they were no longer alone in facing the challenges of the ranch. One afternoon, a visitor from town came to check on the ranch's supplies. It had been years since anyone from outside had been to the property, and John found himself introducing Maria, proudly noting the skills she had developed. The visitor was impressed by her knowledge of the animals, her ability to manage the barn, and the confidence with which she handled questions about the land. John felt a quiet pride swell within him, not just because Maria was capable, but because he recognized how much their partnership had grown. She was no longer just a helper. She was his equal, his companion, and a vital part of the ranch's life. As winter approached, the evenings grew longer, and the need for shared warmth became more evident. John and Maria spent more time together by the fire, sharing meals, stories, and quiet conversation. The bond between them deepened further, moving from mutual respect to a sense of emotional closeness. They began noticing the small gestures, the way Maria would make extra food for him when he worked late, the way John ensured she was comfortable and safe during cold nights, and the subtle smiles exchanged across tasks that had once been purely routine. These small actions, though simple, carried a weight of care and affection that neither had anticipated. One night, a harsh wind rattled the cabin windows, signaling the approach of a winter storm. John and Maria worked together to secure the barn doors, check the fences, and ensure the animals had sufficient feed and water. The storm was strong, but their teamwork had grown so effective that each task was completed with confidence and efficiency. By the time the storm passed, they were tired, wet, and cold, yet there was a sense of accomplishment and closeness. Sitting by the fire afterward, sharing a quiet meal, they realized how much they relied on each other, not just for work, but for emotional support, for companionship, and for the simple comfort of shared presence. As the months passed, subtle signs of deeper feelings began to emerge. John found himself thinking of Maria when she was not near, noticing her absence in ways that surprised him. He appreciated her laughter, her quiet confidence, and her thoughtful attention to every detail of life on the ranch. Maria, too, felt a growing warmth toward John, noticing his steady presence, his quiet humor, and the way he respected her abilities and opinions. There was an unspoken understanding forming between them, a recognition that their relationship was evolving beyond work, trust, or companionship into something more personal, meaningful, and emotionally significant. One afternoon, after a long day of repairing fences, John and Maria walked together across the field, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. The sky was filled with soft colors, the air fragrant with the smell of grass and soil. They spoke little, content to walk side by side, the silence filled with shared understanding. John realized that he valued these moments, these walks, more than any part of his previous solitary life. Maria felt the same, recognizing the comfort and security of being with someone who cared deeply for her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. Even small disagreements, when they occurred, were met with patience and respect. If a task was handled differently than expected, they would discuss it calmly, sharing perspectives and learning from each other. There was no anger, no resentment, only communication and understanding. This approach strengthened their connection, reinforcing the trust and respect that had already grown. They were learning not only to work together, but to live together, to navigate challenges, and to build a shared life step by step. By the end of this period, life on the ranch had changed in subtle but profound ways. The land thrived under their joint care, the animals were healthier than ever, and John and Maria's bond had grown into something undeniably deep. They had moved from a relationship defined by obligation and circumstance into one defined by respect, partnership, and quiet affection. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that what they had built together was only the beginning, that the trust and care they had nurtured could grow into something lasting and meaningful. Spring arrived on the ranch, bringing with it a sense of renewal that matched the quiet transformation of John and Maria's lives. The grass grew greener, the trees budded with fresh leaves, and the air was filled with the soft scent of blossoms. Life had settled into a rhythm, but now the rhythm carried a new depth. John and Maria had become partners in every sense. They shared the labor, the laughter, and even the quiet moments of reflection after a long day. What had begun as a relationship of necessity had slowly blossomed into one of trust, companionship, and the subtle beginnings of love. One morning, John woke early, as he always did, and noticed Maria moving about the barn with a grace and confidence that had grown steadily over the months. She greeted the animals, filled the troughs, and checked the fences without prompting, her efficiency and care a testament to how much she had grown. John watched her quietly, feeling a warmth in his chest that he could no longer ignore. There was more than gratitude for her work. There was admiration, respect, and a quiet affection that had slowly taken root in his heart. He realized that life on the ranch, once lonely and predictable, now held a richness he had never imagined. Maria, meanwhile, felt a similar shift. She had arrived at the ranch uncertain and wary, but over time she had come to appreciate the steady, dependable presence of John Harper. He had never pretended to be more than he was. He was honest, hardworking, and deeply caring, even if he rarely spoke of his feelings. Maria had learned to trust him, to rely on him, and now she found herself wanting to share more than just work with him. She wanted to share her thoughts, her dreams, and perhaps, in a quiet way, her heart. One afternoon, as they tended to the pasture together, Maria noticed a group of wildflowers growing near the fence line. She knelt to gather a few, careful not to damage the stems, and held them in her hands. John watched, amused by the small smile that crossed her face. "Those are beautiful," he said softly, his voice carrying across the field. Maria looked up, caught slightly off guard by the compliment, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was moments like these, small, simple, yet full of meaning, that reminded her how far their relationship had come. As the days passed, their partnership on the ranch became seamless. They anticipated each other's needs, communicated with subtle gestures, and shared tasks without the need for words. Maria would feed the animals while John repaired fences nearby, and he would check on the water troughs while she tended to the garden. Their teamwork was efficient, but it was also filled with small acts of care. A hand on a shoulder to steady a ladder, a gentle nudge to guide a horse, a shared glance when a task was completed successfully. These moments, though unspoken, carried the weight of connection and understanding that neither had anticipated when Maria first arrived. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the hills with shades of gold and pink, John and Maria walked across the pasture together. The air was warm, and the scent of fresh grass filled their senses. John stopped, watching Maria as she paused to admire the horizon. He took a deep breath, feeling the quiet strength of his emotions and the realization that he could no longer deny what he felt. Maria had become more than a partner in work. She had become essential to his life, someone he cared for deeply and wanted to protect, support, and cherish. Maria, sensing the shift in John's demeanor, felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. She had come to respect him, trust him, and value his presence, but now she realized that her feelings were deeper than she had allowed herself to admit. She wanted to be close to him, to share not just the work of the ranch, but the joys and challenges of life itself. She looked at John, seeing the quiet strength, the honesty, and the care that had slowly drawn her in. In that moment, she understood that what they shared had grown into something far more meaningful than either of them had expected. Days later, John decided it was time to act on the feelings that had been quietly growing in his heart. He planned a simple gesture, something that reflected the life they had built together rather than relying on grand displays. He chose the spot on the hill where they often watched the sunset, a place filled with memories of shared work, laughter, and quiet reflection. As the sun began its descent, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, John led Maria to the spot, holding her hand gently. She looked at him, curious and slightly nervous, sensing that something important was about to happen. John took a deep breath, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. "Maria," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "when you first came here, I didn't know what to expect. I thought I was just taking responsibility for someone who had nowhere else to go. But over time, I realized something. I realized that I can't imagine this ranch, this life, without you in it. You've become part of everything I care about. Not because you work hard, not just because you help me, but because I care for you. More than I ever thought I could care for anyone." Maria's eyes filled with emotion as she listened, her hands trembling slightly as she held his. She had felt the same way for some time, but hearing the words aloud made her heart swell. "John," she whispered, I feel the same. I never expected this, but being here with you, it feels like home. You've given me more than a safe place. You've given me trust, respect, and care. I want to be here with you for everything. I want to share my life with you." John smiled, a mixture of relief and joy flooding through him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring, a modest symbol but filled with meaning. "Maria, I don't need ceremony or fanfare. I just need you." Will you be my wife?" Maria's eyes widened, a tear slipping down her cheek, and she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Yes," she finally said, her voice soft but certain. "Yes, John, I will." The moment was quiet, filled with the sounds of the ranch around them. The distant lowing of the cattle, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the fading warmth of the sun on the hills. They held each other, understanding that this was not just a promise of love, but a commitment to partnership, trust, and shared life. They had come to this point not through grand gestures or sudden romance, but through months of work, shared challenges, and the slow building of mutual respect and affection. The days that followed were filled with preparation and celebration in their own quiet way. The small town learned of their engagement, and neighbors came by to offer congratulations, bringing simple gifts of food, flowers, and well wishes. John and Maria worked together to plan a modest ceremony on the ranch, choosing a small grove of trees as the setting. It was intimate, reflective of the life they had built together, and focused entirely on the bond they shared rather than extravagance. The animals, tended to carefully by both, were present in their own way, as witnesses to the partnership that had brought them together. On the day of the ceremony, the sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the fields. Maria wore a simple dress, her hair tied loosely, and a soft smile graced her face. John stood beside her, proud and filled with quiet joy. Friends and neighbors gathered, but the focus remained on them, the rancher and the woman who had arrived under uncertain circumstances, now united in love, trust, and partnership. Vows were exchanged, not with flowery language, but with sincerity, promises of care, support, and shared life. They spoke of the work they would continue together, the challenges they would face, and the commitment to be partners in every sense, just as they had been in the months leading to this day. As they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the ranch felt brighter, more alive. The land they had nurtured together reflected the care, trust, and partnership that had grown between them. The animals thrived, the fences and barns stood strong, and the home they had built was filled with warmth, laughter, and love. John and Maria knew that life would continue to bring challenges, storms, and hard work, but they also knew that together they could face anything. The journey from necessity to partnership to love had been slow, patient, and real, and it had brought them to a place of genuine happiness and fulfillment. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset, sharing quiet conversation, and reflecting on the life they had built. Maria would smile as John recounted stories from his past, and he would laugh at her observations and clever insights. The bond between them had grown into something enduring, grounded not in fantasy or fleeting passion, but in respect, trust, and shared experience. They were partners, friends, and now husband and wife. The ranch, once a place of solitude for John, had become a home for both of them, a place filled with life, warmth, and the quiet certainty that they had found in each other a love worth waiting for.